This is Luke Iorio, and here's this week's Meaningful Moment. Happiness is the hot topic of the moment, and why shouldn't it be? Who among us couldn't use just a little more happiness in our lives and in our careers? And so on this week's Meaningful Moment, I wanted to break down the topic of happiness just a little bit and leave you with some practices to bring a little more happiness into your daily life. We do that by reaching into the archives and pulling some sound bites out of the interview that I did with Emma Seppala, health psychologist and director for Stanford University's Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. Inside of these sound bites, you're going to hear two forms of happiness, one of which is more temporary, and it can lead to things like burnout and stress kind of climbing up in our lives, versus a longer-term form that allows us to really, truly thrive and flourish and expand our well-being. In terms of that burnout, you're going to hear a bit of the mindset that leads to why that occurs and some staggering statistics of what's going on out there. And then ultimately, it's important for us to know the practices, the real life routines and habits and practices that we can use right now in this moment to bring that happiness back in. Enjoy.
One of the things that we know when we look at happiness as a scientific community, it's often divided into two forms. One is a hedonic happiness, which is really sensory or material happiness. It's the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's the food. It's material goods. You know, a new car, a fat paycheck, whatever it is. And those give us a boost of dopamine in the brain. They give us a brief high, but we know that it's also very brief because that's why we're left wanting more. Mm-hmm. And then there's another form of happiness that we call eudaimonic happiness, which is a sense of happiness that comes from connection with others, from altruism, from compassion, from feeling like you have a deeper sense of purpose or meaning, something bigger than yourself. For some people, it takes the form of spirituality. It's something bigger than just you, and it involves connection. It often involves some form of loving connection with others, or doing something beyond just for your own self. And so what we see is that form of happiness is not short-lived. Has a much more long-term effect. I would even call it fulfillment. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the impact of both of those kinds of happiness on your body, individuals whose life is primarily characterized by hedonic happiness, the pleasures of life, have higher inflammation rates, as high inflammation rates, in fact, as people living under very stressful conditions. Whereas those whose life is primarily characterized by eudaimonic happiness have very low levels of inflammation. We also see that individuals who live a very compassionate, altruistic life are protected from the effects of stress. When you look at populations of people who've gone through severe life stressors, that usually impacts longevity. Well, if those people have been engaging in volunteerism or service in some way, it's as if that stress did not happen to them. It does not. That stress does not impact their longevity. Now, this comes only if and only you're doing the altruistic action with a real altruistic motive, not if you're giving money to have your name on a plaque. Right. That's what the research shows anyway.
So it's interesting because I think one of the things that with that hedonic happiness that so often seems to be out there, a lot of that just stems from that feeling of or need for immediate gratification. And I'm kind of curious in some of the work that you've done, how is it that people start to leave that tendency towards immediate gratification behind them and start focusing on what is, and I'll say this specifically, as perceived longer-term efforts. And I think maybe that's part of the challenge, is they view maybe some of these other areas of building loving connection and doing the volunteerism and contribution as longer-term strategies. Whether they are or not is a different story. But I'm curious, how does somebody kind of break that immediate gratification process and really allow themselves to pursue the kind of the doing the work that leads to the real, true, long-term happiness track?
Well, I love your question. You think like a scientist, and honestly, I don't know if anyone has answered that question yet, but I have seen it happen to people.
Right.
And the thing is, with hedonic lifestyle, there is nothing wrong with enjoying the pleasures of life.
Absolutely.
We should, absolutely. But we are also aware that they are so brief, no matter how amazing that piece of cake is in front of you, It's going to be gone in a few minutes, and so will the pleasure. So just having that awareness is very key, because then you find your mind wandering to that, I really should buy a new car. I need that new car or that new dress or that new whatever. Just having that realization that you bought a new car or a new dress before, and this is, it's only led to that short burst. It is not the answer to long-term fulfillment that we want. And it only takes one experience of doing something for someone else, an altruistic act, to really feel how profound the impact is, not only for them, but for yourself. And actually, research shows for anyone who's witnessed the act, it's a very uplifting. It creates a sense of feeling moved. That's why you see so many YouTube videos out there of someone helping someone else, and it goes viral. Why? We're so moved. It's such a profoundly human experience. It's also one that our humanity desperately needs, and it's very moving because it is profoundly beneficial for us, mind, body, spirit, our health, our longevity, our happiness, and of those around us.
You know, there's such truth in when you create that experience, what you begin to feel, let alone even witnessing somebody in those types of moments. It does really truly speak to something that's deeper within us.
You know, we're seeing this large burnout across industries, but let's look at how we're living our lifestyle and how we're approaching work and how we're approaching productivity. We've bought into this idea that we need to be in high adrenaline mode when we work. That's why we overschedule ourselves, overcommit, wait till the last minute to get things done, and overcaffeinate. Would you agree?
I would agree.
Yeah. So, and there's a sense of, this is the only way I can get through things. But what are you doing? You're tapping into your fight or flight response. You're in high adrenaline mode all day long, day after day after day. What is the fight or flight response? It is only meant to be there if you're in a case of life and death. It's meant to get you away from danger fast so that you can come back and recuperate your energy and all of the resources you've burned, because the fight or flight response burns not just your physical resources, but also your mental, taxes your cognition as well, your attention, your memory, and so forth. And here we've bought into this idea that we can't have success without stress, that we have to have it all the time, and yet then we wonder why we come home at night, it's 5 or 6, and we collapse, we have no energy. We've just been sitting on our butt all day, presumably at an office. There's no reason to be so depleted, and yet it's because we're going with this go high adrenaline mode. And then you're seeing, anti-anxiety consumption skyrocket, sleeping medications skyrocket, or in the evening needing alcohol just to calm down because you're so wired. And this is completely depleting our nervous system and damaging our well-being, not to mention our mind, because when you're in that state, you're not in the best state to make good decisions. You're not in the best state to be creative, and you're not in the best state to be emotionally intelligent in your relationships with other people, which are critical, whether it's your personal or professional life. So, one of the things that I talk about is that I've worked with some of the most stressed individuals in our society, which are veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're locked into fight or flight permanently, it seems like, because of what they've gone through. And so they can't sleep, they're extremely anxious, jumpy, and then they can't focus, et cetera, et cetera. And we used a very brief intervention, a breathing-based workshop for 1 week. And after 1 week, they had normalized, their anxiety had normalized, and that was maintained 1 month and 1 year later, suggesting permanent improvement. To talk a lot about breathing as a way to build your resilience, to tap into the opposite of fight or flight, which is your parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and digest, which allows you to repair yourself, which allows you to be resilient. Because if we're constantly running around in high adrenaline mode, we're not resilient. We're living on the edge, and we're choosing to do so. And so if you, not to say you can do, you won't have pressure coming your way. Yes, we have life stresses and pressures coming our way, inevitably. But there's a lot we can do about how we set ourselves up in the face of that. And the first thing we can do is to step out of fight or flight mode, at least the part that we're contributing to, through the caffeine and the other things that we do, where we're just, we believe we can't be productive unless we're constantly in this stress mode. So this has a lot to do with managing your energy, because excitement and thrill and stress are things that we value. If you ask Americans to define happiness, they're going to use high-intensity words like excitement and thrill. And if you ask East Asian countries like Korea, China, Japan, individuals living there, to define happiness, they're going to say words like calmness, peacefulness, and those kinds of low-intensity words. And what we're doing here is that we value high intensity in our positive emotions, We also value high intensity in our negative emotions, stress. And so what we're doing is we're constantly tapping into our fight or flight, even in our positive emotions. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Like we never say something like, I feel so calm to speak on the podcast with you. Like we just don't use those words. But at the same time, we're not managing our energy. And there's a lot to be said for calmness. Calmness allows your attention to be broader. Calmness allows you not to expend unnecessary energy when it's not needed. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be excited or thrilled or have a lot of enthusiasm, for example, when you're giving a presentation. But it does mean that you can nurture calmness in those moments where you don't need to exert a ton of energy. You're going to go through your inbox. You don't need to be jacked up on caffeine to do that. You can be calm. You can stay calm. In fact, you'll probably respond more skillfully. At the end of the day, you'll have preserved your energy, which is a very big factor in resilience.
Yeah. I just want to ask you about some of the kind of the everyday things that we can start to adopt. But for everybody, that you just triggered in my mind, it's kind of a joke that we have in our offices, is that I have told a lot of my team members that one of the things that just puts a smile on my face is walking by their office and I want to see them staring out the window. And you're not going to hear that in many businesses, but we love that effect. And so just consider for yourself that some of the most productive time that you could have would be just taking 15 minutes, maybe go outside, sit down, watch the breeze through the trees, or something that just takes your attention and grounds it for a little while. It may be the best 15 minutes you spend all day. And so I'm curious, Emma, from your standpoint and all of the, the research and all the work that you've done, what are some of the kind of the everyday practices that we can start to put in place for ourselves to help us ground us more into this happiness track and this kind of way of being?
Well, a very simple one is gratitude. And that sounds simplistic, but 3 times more positive things than negative happen to us every day, research shows. And yet we also know from research that our brain focuses on the negative. So think about it. You presumably slept with a roof above your head. You've had 3 or more meals a day. You have some nice clothes to wear, and you have the listening to this podcast. And you get a bad email from somebody, and all of a sudden, your day is ruined. But think about it. Like, the brain is focused on that one email. There is so much going right in your life. And yet our brain has this tendency. So gratitude is a great way to combat that. So what do I mean by gratitude? Even just thinking and reminding yourself of a couple of things going really right in your life is just that. Talk about grounding yourself into reality. People think they're being realistic when they're being negative. Wrong. Honestly, unless you're living in a war-torn country or devastated in some way, you are very fortunate. And even sometimes when you go to those countries in which people are poorest and lacking in most in everything, that's sometimes where you see the greatest smiles too. So there's no excuse, honestly. It's your life, and it's what do you want to do with it? It's really up to you. And yes, your brain may have a tendency to focus on the negative, but you have greater awareness and consciousness and choice. So gratitude is a great way for you to just remind yourself, wait, hold on, reality check here. I am so lucky.
And I want to thank you for listening to this week's Meaningful Moment. I am grateful to have you and all of the listeners that are out there following along with The Meaningful Way. It would be a huge favor to me if you would go on to iTunes or Stitcher, whatever your favorite podcast app is, and leave us a review, leave us a rating. Let us know how we're doing. It's really instrumental for how we get the word out about the Meaningful Way podcast. Also, if you like some of the insights that you got from Emma Seppala this week, I'm going to encourage you to check out the World Happiness Summit in Miami, March 17th to 19th. Emma is one of the speakers down there, and it is going to be truly a one-of-a-kind, extraordinary event on this topic of how do we bring more happiness to our everyday lives, and how do we start it as a movement that spreads across the globe. So I encourage you to check out that summit. You can find it at happinesssummit.world. That's happinesssummit.world. I hope to see you there.